Moving on, we have optional visuals. We have texture, alternate texture, effect, transparency, and reduced texture. Texture you can change by clicking the elliptical button on the side, as well as the same with alternate texture. What texture is it assigns the main texture to use for this entity, where alternate texture will assign the texture to use when the script is called. Say for instance, when you flip a light switch or press a button, it uses an alternate texture to signify that that button's been pressed. We also have effect. This is a FX file, which you'll see at the end here. This normally is used for shaders and bump mapping. You can change this effect by clicking on the elliptical, and you can see by default FPS Creator has a bunch of different ones in it, like Ripple. We also have some bump maps and Q maps, and also illumination effects. You normally want to leave this alone unless you know what you're doing. We also have transparency. Currently it's set to 0. You can set this value either to 0 or 1. If you were to set this value to 1, this means that this entity is going to check the texture data that we have here for any alpha data. So basically, this TGA file can hold alpha data, so transparency effects, and what it will do, if set to 1, it will check that texture there for any transparency, and then render it onto this entity or model. If you were to set this to 0, that means that it's not going to check the texture at all for any transparency effects, and it's just going to render it fully. Finally, we have reduced texture. This is a global setting that allows you to set the texture's quality. This setting enables you to either have this texture be reduced in quality or have it be full res. You can set this to -1 to mean this entity is going to have completely high res textures. So when you're building your game, if you were to set this entity at low texture quality and you have this reduced texture property as -1, that means that even though your game is set to low quality, which is 128 pixels by 128, this entity itself is going to stay at 512 pixels by 512 pixels. Of course, you can also change these values from 0, which means this entity is going to have 512 pixels by 512 pixels graphic quality, or you can change it to 2, 4, and 8. 2 meaning 256 pixels. If you change it to 4, this means that this entity is going to use 128 pixels in texture quality, or you can change this to 8, which also means that this texture is going to use the lowest quality, which is 64 pixels wide and 64 pixels high. Now to move on to statistics. I'm going to cancel out of this and choose our character again. I'm going to minimize each one of these and keep statistics open. So at the top we have lives. This will set the amount of lives that the character has. It can be set anywhere from 1 to a very high number such as 99. We also have health. This sets the starting and maximum health for this character. So currently it's at 100. If I wanted him to die fast, I could set this to 10 if I wanted to. So basically one shot with a nice weapon will kill this character automatically. We also have speed. Again, you can think of this speed as a percentage. So currently this character's speed is 100%. If you wanted to have this character move slower, so move half as fast, you could set this to 50, which could mean 50%. Or if you wanted the character to move double speed, you could set that to 200, which means he's going to move 100% faster than he normally would. Underneath we have hurt fall. This sets the amount of damage this character will receive when he jumps or falls from a high area. You can set this anywhere from 0 to basically instant death, so 999 if you want it to. Underneath that, we have is immobile. You can change this from no to yes by using the drop down. What this property does is it sets whether or not the character can move from its spawn place. We also have is objective. What this property does is it allows you to signify if this entity or character is an objective in the game. What you'll have to do is, currently it's set to 0, and if you wanted this character to be an objective, so the player must kill this character, you can set it to a high number such as 1 or 2, depending on how many objectives you have in your game. Underneath that, we have physics. We have physics always on, always active, physics weight, physics friction, force damage, rotative thrown, explodable, and explode damage. Starting off with physics always on. Here you can tell the game whether or not this entity is always going to be using physics. An example of not using physics would be if this character was walking around the level and he was set to physics not always on, the character, instead of pushing the box, may actually end up walking through the box. Depending on what kind of computer power you have, normally you want to set this to yes, but also depending on what you want your character to be doing, you may want to set this to no. The physics will turn on if set to no whenever this character sees the player. Underneath that, we have always active. You can set this to no or yes depending on the drop down. What this property does is it controls whether or not this entity or character is running its logic either all of the time, so set to yes, or only when the player is close, which means set to no. Now what I mean by logic is basically not only is it going to be the physics of the game, it can also be the scripts. So whether or not you want this character to run its main script or shoot script all the time to check for the player, not only when the player is close, you can set always active to yes. Now for these next ones, I'm going to switch over back to our box here. And then come down again to physics. And we left off at physics weight. What this does is it describes how heavy this entity is. If this entity is light enough, so say a range from anywhere from 0 to just an estimated guess, but let's say 6,000, the player will be able to pick the box up and throw it around. If you make this weight too heavy, the player won't be able to push or move the box or even pick it up. Depending on what kind of entity you want, you may want to play around with the weight, and let's pretend it's a metal entity. It's going to have a more significant weight than a wooden box or wooden crate may have, so you're going to have to play around with this number a lot to figure it out. We also have physics force. What this property describes is how easily this entity is going to either slide across the floor or basically move across the floor. So as you can see, we have 11,750 physics friction. Again, you're going to have to play with this number multiple times in order to figure out the best value. So what you may want to end up doing is putting a bunch of different entities in your level, checking their physics property, and then moving on a number from there. Underneath we have physics force damage. What this does is it sets the amount of damage the player or a character will receive if the object is thrown directly at them. So if I was a player and I picked up this box and threw it directly at my enemy over here on the right, Eventually he should receive 100 damage as long as the box directly hits him.